We had a few weeks that we had some snow and had to cancel services, so some of my messages here about Christmas are a little bit behind the times, but I didn't want to save this for a whole nother year. I mean, we're not that far away from it, but I'm sorry to be hounding on that because sometimes we just can't wait till the whole thing is over with, and here I'm throwing it back in your face again. However, there's a lot of people out there that are upset because of the winter storm that we had. People feel like they got cheated out of Christmas, so they're all still talking about the storm and they got cheated out of their Christmas celebration. Oh my. Well, as we know, Christmas is over with and kind of out of our way for another year. The stores, they stopped playing the music, the ones that get stuck in our head. There's one song out there, I won't even mention it because when I hear it, I can't get it out of my head. It's just such a bother. But actually, my wife says that there's a few places that are still playing the music. They haven't got the word yet. There's still decorations up. But life is kind of normal again. Now, I mentioned once before about my Christmas story about maybe 5 years ago, but I want to tell it again with a little bit more added material. So as we move past another Christmas holiday, I want to tell you about my Christmas dilemma. And that's the title, My Christmas Dilemma. Now, Christmas was a big thing in the Bella household when I was growing up. My mom really liked to decorate for Christmas, and she would start right after Thanksgiving, and it would be up until the new year began. She always tried to make it nice for us. Christmas Day was one of the only days that my dad would actually play a game with us, usually one that we got a new one, and after that, and never again, but it seemed like there was always this big buildup of anticipation for the day to come, and then it was over within a second. It was gone. Well, a day finally came that changed my whole perspective about Christmas, which had a big, everlasting impact on my view of this day. My parents sat me down and told me that there was no Santa Claus. I know that seems silly right now, but I was devastated. And I thought my parents were lying to me. How could this possibly be? I was very confused. Why were my parents lying to me and telling me there was no such thing as Santa Claus? Or was this whole Santa Claus thing a lie to begin with? It really had an impact on me. I actually wanted to believe there was such a person out there. So in school the next day, I decided I was going to tell some of my friends when we were eating lunch in the cafeteria. And because they were all talking about Santa Claus, he was coming to the Ames shopping plaza in a helicopter that coming Saturday. Well, that did not go well with them because a couple of the guys were bigger than me and they wanted to beat me up. And I told them there was no such thing as Santa Claus. So they called over the lunchroom monitor and told her what I said. And she confirmed to us all that, Santa Claus is real. And he's going to be coming to the Ames shopping plaza this Saturday. You can go see him. Well, I went home that day very angry at my parents for lying to me. I mean, again, it had a big impact on me. So I confronted them. And then they told me that, you can't be going around saying that because you don't want to ruin it for the other children whose parents have not told them the truth yet. Again, you may think this is kind of ridiculous, but it had a great impact on me. My parents did lie to me. They told me there was a Santa Claus. They lied about there being a Santa Claus. Because I really, again, wanted to believe there was such a person that existed. Then he told me what the real meaning of Christmas was, that it was about Jesus. But I believe that, okay, this was the next lie in the sequence. How old do I have to get before they tell me that Jesus isn't real? That's the way my mind was working. My family didn't go to church. So I thought maybe this was just another lie. They weren't really a religious people. They went to church when they were kids, and that was about it. The Santa Claus, he was supposed to bring presents to all the children in the world by coming down the chimneys at night. I always wondered how he got into our trailer. We had no chimney. Did they leave the door open for him? But many parents, they actually tell this lie to their children every single year. Yet Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 15, verse 19, "For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, false witness. These are the things which defile a man." Matthew chapter 19 and verse 18, "You shall not bear false witness." Mark chapter 10, verse 19, again, Jesus says, "Do not bear false witness." Do not lie. Luke chapter 18, verse 20, "You know the commandments. Do not bear false witness." It is a sin to break the 9th commandment, according to Jesus. Those fully observing Christmas also seem to forget that Jesus taught that Satan was a liar and the father of lies. And that once their children get older, they will realize that their parents lied to them, as I did. This is what really bothered me the most. Now, the Reams version of the New Testament specifically shows that Jesus taught the following. In John chapter 8, starting in verse 43, "Why do you not know my speech? Because you cannot hear my word. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you will do. For he was a murderer from the beginning, and he stood not in the truth, because the truth is not in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father thereof. But if I say the truth, you believe me not." Lying to children does not improve the bond between parents and children. It can really hurt a family. Please tell your children and grandchildren the truth. Jesus always told the truth. Christmas was, from then on, wasn't the same for me. I actually didn't like it so much. Especially since now I knew it was my parents that were giving me the gifts. And, I always wondered why I didn't get that Rock'em Sock'em Robots that I always wanted as a kid. And they'd always tell me I must not have been good. Santa Claus must have thought you weren't good. No, it was them that thought I wasn't good. But so that was another stain in my relationship with my parents with that. But I do remember also at that age that I was kind of getting upset about the commercialization of Christmas. As I mentioned in a recent message. But actually, I actually started to wish Jesus a happy birthday on Christmas and felt that I was the only one that remembered that it was supposed to be about him. Many Christians, see the commercialism and they say that we should put Christ back into Christmas. However, it's kind of impossible to put Christ back into Christmas since he never was in Christmas in the first place. My family continued to make a big deal out of celebrating Christmas, but it wasn't my favorite time of the year. It's because my birthday was, the 11th, this past Wednesday here. So I never got gifts on my birthday because they said, well, you just got some Christmas. Well, there wasn't a whole lot of gifts that I got, but, so I always I always hated that my birthday was right after Christmas because I never got nothing on my birthday either. A lot of childhood problems I had, right? However, I did have one favorite Christmas. Yep, believe it or not, I did have one favorite Christmas. See, my dad's cousin that he worked with, and her family, you know, my dad's cousin and, you know, their family, they gathered some donations together, a bunch of different gifts, and her husband worked with my dad, and her son, along with my dad and I, we took them to one of their former co-workers that kind of fell on some bad times. He was a Native American. He was living up on the Tuscarora Indian Reservation, and they were living in a little small house up there, if you even want to call that a house, more like a shack. But we walked in and greeted him, and him and his wife, they were really happy to see my dad and my and their other co-worker, my dad's cousin. So we started bringing in all the different gifts that we'd gathered, and they were all tearing up with gladness. And off to the kitchen, there was this little bedroom in there, which I could see had like triple bunk beds. I never seen a triple bunk bed. That was the first time. And there was like 7 children that were kind of like peering out, like from here all the way down. They were just peering out. They were really disciplined. They stayed in there. They didn't come into the kitchen. They stayed in their bedroom just peeking out with wide eyes, looking at all the stuff we were bringing in. And when the first come in there, the kitchen's here, the bedroom's here, there's a little living room, very small little living room. And there was a small little Christmas tree that probably stood about that high, with 7 small little gifts underneath it wrapped up. Most likely, probably a pair of socks. And that was probably all that those children were going to be receiving that year. You know, this experience had a great impact on me, and it showed, you know, the true meaning of giving. My view of Christmas was now more on giving to others and not self, not wanting to get things. And I still didn't like Christmas, but you know, I know this meant a lot to my mom, so I endured through it. But this example of giving to this needy family, the problem is it could have been done sooner. It could have been done anytime. Didn't have to wait for Christmas to do this. I'm sure they were on hard times for a long time. But this experience of helping someone who fell on hard times was meaningful for me. So the so-called Christmas spirit of giving, again, can happen anytime. The Bible teaches us to be charitable and to help the needy. I don't remember too many other Christmases from my youth, and really didn't care for it much when I was stationed in Germany during my Air Force days. Same thing when I was out in California, where I was stationed afterwards. And in fact, once I got out of the service, I actually started to research Christmas at the library. I was just finding out all kinds of information about Christmas and its origins, and it was just fascinating. And I look at that now and I realize it was God was calling me and revealing the truth to me at that time. I was still living out there in California with a friend who, he was still in the Air Force, and I spent the whole day in the library discovering the pagan roots of Christmas. They actually had to throw me out finally. I was borrowing paper from them and taking all kinds of notes. And what I found out is that it was nearly 400 years after the birth of Jesus that a date was actually fixed, being December 25th. Having no exact references to the birthday of Jesus, the Roman Catholic Church borrowed a festival from another great midwinter event, the Roman celebration of the birth of the unconquered Son. This celebration was declared to fall on December 25th by the Roman Emperor Aurelian in 274 CE. And there had been a cult of Sol, S-O-L, Sol, meaning the sun, in Rome from very early times. The Etruscans, that predated the Romans by several hundred years, they founded their capital city of Kizil Alma, or actually it means the golden apple, around 750 BCE. The city was renamed Roma by the wandering Romans who intermingled with the Etruscans. They worshipped the sun god Cotha, or Catha, C-A-T-H-A, which was later identified with the Roman sun god Sol. In about 10 BCE, the Roman Emperor Augustus replaced Sol with the Greek Apollo and instituted a celebratory games in honor of this god, Apollo, who also was a god of the sun. I found many references to other gods whose birth date was on December 25th. Horus of Egypt, Mithra of Persia, which became Mithras of Rome. And there's many others that go back. I continue to find more and more pagan beginnings to Christmas celebration being practiced in religions that predated the actual birth of Jesus Christ. In fact, what I found out is every single aspect of a Christmas celebration, every single tradition came from this religion, this, they all pieced it together in one big celebration called Christmas. But every one of those celebrations, from the Christmas tree to decorating, to the different symbols and the colors and everything else of Christmas, was occurring in pagan religions well before Jesus Christ was ever born. Most of them all began in Babylon. I was overwhelmed. Now I had proof that Christmas had nothing to do with Jesus. I was excited. I was so excited I couldn't wait to tell everybody. So I went back and after they kicked me out of the library, I went back, and my first victim was my roommate. You've heard me tell this story many times. I started to tell him, and then he walked away. He walked into his bedroom. Guess he didn't want to hear this, right? But it didn't stop me from continuing to rant. I kept on almost following him and saying it. And he comes walking out of his bedroom with a stack of Plain Truth magazines. And he told me that he grew up in the church, grew up in a church that did not celebrate Christmas. He introduced me to the World Tomorrow program with Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong. And we stayed up watching these shows and talking about all these things many, many nights. Imagine my surprise that the first person I decided to tell Christmas was pagan already knew. See, he grew up in the church, and he kind of knew what was going on with this. And I'm happy to say that he's still in the church, and a lot of you know who he is. So it's really good to see that we're both here still keeping God's truth. But it did lead me to the church, this thing called Christmas, and my disbelief of it. It was the catalyst that brought me into contact with the truth and church, and it was a thing that God used to guide me there. So now I can understand why I was so upset about this and that in my youth. God had a purpose. It's very interesting how things work out when God is trying to call you. This was the door that brought me into the Church of God. I met my future wife in the church. We were married, and I had our first child. And things were okay in the church, yet there were some changes that were being made to the doctrines that were established by Jesus Christ in God, in the Bible, that was held by the church. We went to our last Feast of Tabernacles in the church in 1995. Then they said there was no more celebrating of the feast days. The church began to move away from Christ's teaching. The Sabbath, they said, was no longer important, that we don't need to keep it the way we were keeping it, although we continue to have services on the Sabbath, on Saturday. It just wasn't held up as important anymore. Times were rough for us all back then. It was one of the worst times in my life. Tensions were very high. My wife and I survived a little bit of a rocky marriage there at the time. We were struggling with things. Our daughter was born. We hung on the best that we could. There was other people that were leaving the church and starting other different groups, going here and there and trying to convince us to go with them. That was some difficult times. Some of the people that were the pillars in our church, some of the deacons and that were in our church that were pillars, trying to go to them to advice and help them to solve different things. And some of them were getting divorced now. And it was a tough time. We were just hanging on. And then all of a sudden the church changed their stance on military service. Said, oh, it's okay to be in the military service because we're not keeping the Sabbath no more, so it's not going to interfere with that. And that's why I went back into the Army. This time I did 4 years in the Air Force. Now I went and joined the Army. And we continued to attend the church because the church told us that if we left the church, we were no longer going to be part of God's kingdom. So we continued on. We were deceived, and it was tough. We went along with that, with no more holy days, no more Sabbath. The Sabbath was just reduced to another day. Plus there was many other changes. We were told that these changes were directed by the Holy Spirit. Again, we were also told constantly that if we left the church, we had no part in the kingdom of God. Now, I did totally reject this new view in which the church started to embrace the idea of the Trinity. Yet I kept silent. I wasn't quite about the new teaching that our calling wasn't special, because I know it was. I know that my calling was special. I came kicking and screaming. I played Jonah quite a few times, running away. I never ended up in the big fish, but just as bad. But I know my calling was special. And then the leader at that time, Mr. Joe DeKotch Jr., he told us that we can now celebrate Christmas. We were told that it honors Christ and gives awareness of our Savior, Jesus Christ. We were told that this was one of the greatest events in mankind, and we should celebrate it with other Christians. Yes, it was a great event. But are we to honor this holiday? I had an extremely hard time with this, as you can imagine from my story thus far. I come full circle now. After all, my unbelief in Christmas is what led me into the church to begin with. Only to have the leaders in the church saying it's okay to celebrate it now. Now, one of the scriptures in the New Testament, which was used to say that it's okay to celebrate Christmas in this article by this leader, was in the book of Romans, chapter 14. In Romans chapter 14, beginning in verse 5, it says, "One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. Now, when you read this chapter from the beginning and you understand the context that's being talked about in this chapter, it's referring to fast days. Fast days, because a lot of the Jews had some set fast days that they would do. And this was all talking about fast days. It wasn't talking about changing different holy days and every other thing like they were trying to say here. Many will try to use this to say that we don't have to keep the holy days or the Sabbath. But it had to do with fast days. However, these same verses were used to keep Christmas and Sunday, and not for keeping the holy days and the Sabbath. But I wasn't focused enough to see this. I was deceived. I was deceived. I was weak in the spirit, and therefore I was spiritually immature at the time. It wasn't long before everyone was celebrating Christmas in the church. I was amazed, especially with those who grew up in the church. Their whole life, they were denied this one thing. And now they were allowed to indulge themselves in the festivities of Christmas. They couldn't wait to sink their teeth into this forbidden fruit. Yes, we finally fell too, to my shame. Rose and our children saw everyone else falling into this trap. Say, well, why can't we do this? So we jumped in too. We got a Christmas tree. An artificial one. Decorated and exchanged gifts. But I never did tell my children that there was such a thing as a Santa Claus. I never told them, just the opposite, in fact. And when my daughter, she was old enough to question it, I told her the truth. She replied, I knew that fat man wasn't real, or something like that, she said. She knew he wasn't real. We never taught our children that. I wasn't going to lie to them like I was lied to. Yeah, we did this a couple times, and then one year, Rose wanted to have a real Christmas tree. A real Christmas tree. So I buckled under the pressure. We went to get one in Lackawanna on Ridge Road. It cost me $65. I put it in the back of the truck. We got on the thruway heading back home to Hamburg. We'd driven a good distance and we heard something. Rose says, the tree. The tree fell out of the truck. It's laying on the thruway. I pull over, and it's night. It's dark. I'm running back there. There's cars. I see their headlights. They're swerving around the tree. When they get by me, they're beeping their horns, and I couldn't hear what they were saying, of course, but they were upset. But semi-tractor trailers, they don't swerve. They ran over it. There was a few of them was running over the tree. I finally got up there. I went into the road, dodging traffic, pulled the tree out, and I see a whole bunch of branches broken off in there. So I grab the branches. I grab all these branches as much as I could, grabbed the whole thing, brought it back in the truck, drove back home, didn't say a thing. I was so upset. Got home, got some hammer, nails. I started hammering back the branches back on the thing, used some duct tape to hold it all together. I put the tree in the corner there. And I says, there's your Christmas tree. There's your stupid tree. Never again. I was upset. I look at it now as that was God telling me, why'd you go and do something stupid like that? Why'd you go back and do that? That stupid tree. That stupid tree. Cannot believe that. After that, I slowly started just to back away from Christmas. I wasn't going to do it no more. I just knew it was wrong. I knew that God was telling me that I shouldn't be doing this. And I can give a whole sermon on Christmas trees, but and their origin. But to sum it up, evergreen trees was part of the pagan god worship for many years, way before Christianity. The Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Babylonians, pretty much where it all started, all displayed evergreens as a tribute to their respective sun gods. But they never had one held together by duct tape. So I began to question the leadership of the church and the changes that they made. I examined one more scripture that was quoted in a letter from Mr. Joe DeKotch Jr., and that's Philippians chapter 1, verse 15 through 18, if you want to turn to there and look at that with me. Philippians chapter 1, and beginning in verse 15, says, "Indeed, some preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. But the latter, out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And in this I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice." Brethren, this was a real stretch in using these verses as an example of why we can keep Christmas. It is plain to see that Paul had heard that some were actually preaching about Jesus for their own ambition, to prop themselves up. Of course, there are some out there that were truly serving God sincerely, as he says that Jesus was being preached. The truth about Jesus and his teachings were being taught here. They were being taught. They were being taught. Now, the attitude or the purpose for these people speaking it might have been a little bit different. Some were doing it to say, look how great I am talking about this truth. And some were sincerely trying to do the right thing. Daniel's excited, isn't he? But the truth was being taught. Not some other false Jesus who was born on December 25th. Now this scripture was taken by the church to say that Jesus is being taught by celebrating a pagan festival that truly honors Satan. The God of the Bible condemns using pagan practices to worship him. He does not appreciate that one bit. Notice what God had his prophet Jeremiah write. In Jeremiah chapter 10 verses 2 through 5, I'm going to be reading from the Old King James Version. "Thus saith the Eternal, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of a workman with an axe. They deck it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers, just like I did. I fastened it with a hammer too, and nails, and duct tape, so that it would not move. Believe me, it didn't move. They didn't have duct tape back then. They are upright as a palm tree, but speak not. They must needs to be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil. Neither also is them is to do good. God clearly says not to adopt non-Christian forms of worship. And this seems to include objects like a Christmas tree. Now, some may argue, since a tree cannot do evil, is it okay to have them anyways? Those who feel that way may wish to ask themselves why God then would want to say the following to those with such trees. Mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 11. Thus ye say unto them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens. The God of the Bible clearly does not want people to use Christmas trees to pretend to honor him, as he clearly is not honored by such things. Of course, some may wish to reason about that by claiming that they're not trying to honor they are trying to honor the God of the Bible and not some pagan gods, or with such things as a Christmas tree. Or even reason around it by simply, not having Christmas trees, but still observing Christmas as it honors Jesus. And thus, this is not a sin. I do find it interesting how every Christmas morning, children are bowing down before the tree on their knees. If they can't see that, perhaps the following may help them realize the sins involved in this. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, beginning in verse 29. When the eternal your God cuts off from before you the nations which you go to dispossess, and you displace them and dwell in their lands, take heed to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed from before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? I also will do likewise. You shall not worship the eternal your God in that way. For every abomination to the eternal which he hates they have done to their gods. For they burn even their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it nor take away from it. Now many will reason that this was Old Testament writings and Jesus is more forgiven. Jesus is the one who inspired these words to be written. Now in the December 10th, 2010 email, the Glendale, California-based Grace Communion International, which was the former Worldwide Church of God, sent out a link to a short video titled, Is Keeping Christmas a Sin? Is Keeping Christmas a Sin? By its president, Joe DeKoch Jr. In it, he stated, in this article, Is Keeping Christmas a Sin? It says, in my younger days, I believed that celebrating Christmas was a sin. I wanted to let the Bible guide me in everything I did, and since I couldn't find any command in the Bible to keep Christmas, I concluded that keeping it must be a sin. Of course, it wasn't a very good logic, and it kept me from enjoying one of the most meaningful and joyous celebrations of the year. After all, if we never did anything that is specifically commanded in the Bible, we wouldn't have Sunday school, children's church, English language Bibles, printing presses, public address systems, fire alarms, and charcoal grills. None of these were specifically commanded in the Bible. Wow. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. Just because charcoal grills is not mentioned in the Bible, we're not allowed to have them? This reasoning is flawed. I'm sorry. He's relying on human reasoning, not the Bible. His logic simply does not have proper biblical support. For example, while Sunday school or children's church is not in the Bible, teaching children daily is in the Bible. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 18 and 19 says to teach your children daily. In his presentation, Mr. Tkach also stated, the fact that the Bible doesn't command us to celebrate Christmas is not a valid argument against Christmas celebration. Brethren, as we have seen today, there are many biblical valid arguments against keeping and observing Christmas that he apparently overlooked. Look at the title of his letter. Is keeping Christmas a sin? Is keeping Christmas a sin? Okay, what is a sin? What is a sin? The Apostle John wrote in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, the old King James Version here, says, whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law. For sin is the transgression of the law. What law are we talking about here? We're talking about the Ten Commandments. We have already seen how Christmas breaks the ninth commandment through lying to your children about these things. Does it break the other commandments? It definitely breaks the first commandment, as God is not being worshipped the way that he wants to be. They have this other God propped up, this Santa Claus or whatever. How should we worship God? Well, Jesus tells us in John chapter 4 how we are supposed to worship God. John chapter 4, verse 23. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. Listen to this next scripture and see how it can be applied to Christmas worship. Mark chapter 7 and verse 6 and verse 7. Mark chapter 7, verse 6, beginning in. He answered and said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. All these practices for Christmas was derived by men. They came up with these traditions. They came up with the trees, the Yule logs, the mistletoe, the poinsettia, the colors of red and green, and all the other things, and giving the gifts, and St. Nick, and Santa Claus, and Kris Kringle, and all that. All that was made up by man. It's not in the Bible. These are doctrines that are based on commandments of men, not God. Teaching traditions that men came up with to honor their false gods. That's what this is. The second and third commandments are obvious in how Christmas breaks them. False gods, idol worshiping, taking the name of Christ in vain, Christ Mass. This does not give honor to Christ's name at all. The fourth commandment, as we know, keeping the Sabbath holy. Well, how can Christmas break the Sabbath day? In Leviticus chapter 23 lists all of God's holy days, including the Sabbath. Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 1. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, the feast of the Eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feast. And he goes and he talks about his feast days. Today is a feast day. It's the Sabbath. It's commanded. And so are the holy days, the annual holy days that we celebrate. This is a system of worship that includes the Sabbath, which God set up for us to observe. We want to know how to worship him, what days we're supposed to worship him on. It's all spelled out in Leviticus chapter 23. It tells us right there. These are the days. You're not supposed to add to those days. You're not supposed to take away from those days. Many of these churches out there have done that. God says not to do that. The holy days are coming up. The spring holy days, we can't wait for that. At that time, we're planning on where we're going for the Feast of Tabernacles. And it goes by so quick, but we look forward to those days. To deviate from these or to add to this is against God. In Matthew chapter 28, Jesus himself tells, or actually instructs us what to do. Matthew chapter 28, in verse 19, he says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you." The key phrase is, all things that I have commanded you. Not something that was added 400 years later. Honor your parents, the fifth commandment. Does Christmas honor God our Father, Christ our brother, or even the church, our mother? By observing this holiday, which has nothing to do with God or Jesus, we dishonor God. Read Malachi chapter 1 on your own time. Read that. Now, the next few commandments are broken spiritually, since the law applies to us spiritually. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder, is broken by those who would condemn or persecute us for not even keeping these days. Some really get mad at us for not celebrating Christmas. Oh, it's unchristian after all. However, being mad at your brother is spiritual murder. But speaking of murder, some of the crime stats that are out there, from the JeremyCoon.com website, they looked at homicides in San Francisco from like 1849 to 2003. It says New Year's Day is by far the most violent day of the year, followed by Christmas Day. And we know that New Year's Eve is just the end of this whole celebration of the pagan worship of Saturnalia and all that went through that whole period of time. New Year's Eve is associated with the same thing. From the Tech7USA.com website, it's Tech7 Security Solutions. According to the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, a 2016 study that analyzed the amount of police recorded crimes from December 24th to January 2nd of that year. The article goes on to say, as can be seen, there is an obvious spike in violent offenses on New Year's Eve and day. The number of recorded incidents of violent offenses between these times are more than 9 times of that of any other days in the period. There is also a small peak on Christmas Eve in the afternoon, which is followed by a slight decrease over Christmas Day. Again, pointing out that there's a lot of crime. Violent offenses. A lot of violent offenses, which includes murder, attempted murder, manslaughter, domestic violence-related assault. There's a lot of that. even non-domestic violence, assault, assault against police, sexual assault, indecent assault or act of indecency, other sexual offenses, robbery with or without a weapon. You know, the criminality tends to peak more during the holiday season because of a few factors. The holiday season is shown to add more stress, depression, and even anger to some people's lives, depending on their present circumstance. Just recently, this last, Christmas 2022, the New York Post, the main article says, at least 16 people shot dead, 16 others wounded over Christmas weekend in U.S. Goes on to say that gun violence cut a bloody swath through the U.S. over the Christmas weekend, leaving at least 16 people dead, including a 3-year-old Missouri girl, and 25 others wounded nationwide. On Christmas, the most wonderful time of the year, with all that Christmas joy and spirit. So what about the seventh commandment? Seventh commandment about adultery. How could that be part of this? Well, in James chapter 4 and verse 4, it says, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. I mean, there's just a lot of things here. When we first came into the church, especially after me and Rose were married, our families were really upset that we would not even attend, the gatherings on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. And what about those work parties, those Christmas work parties? To compromise is to give in. It's to be friends with these worldly systems. I, for one, do not want to be an enemy of God. Remember that in the Old Testament, idolatry and adultery were one and the same according in God's eyes. At Mount Sinai, when he delivered the commandments to Israel and they accepted those, that was a marriage contract between God, between Jesus Christ, and the people of Israel. And when they were in the land and decided they were going to go talk to the Assyrians or the Egyptians for protection against this foe or that foe, God considered that to be adultery, that they were cheating on him by going to other nations for protection and not asking their husband for protection. Well, Jesus Christ is going to be married to us. We are the bride. We are the church. We are the bride of Christ. So we are worshiping someone else besides Jesus Christ, and celebrating Christmas is not worshiping Jesus Christ, then we are committing adultery, because Jesus Christ is our betrothed, or we are his betrothed. The eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal. Well, we know that Malachi 3 talks about robbing God, and you wouldn't believe how many people withhold the money they designated to be offerings to the church to buy gifts. But spiritually, we do rob God of our worship by giving it to some false god that was born on December 25th. Also, some more stats from the hg.org, which deals with legal resources. It says, do crimes increase near the holidays? Again, talking about crimes increasing during the holidays. So according to reports from the National Crime Victimization Survey, two specific types of crime increase in December: robbery and personal larceny. These two crimes increased by approximately 20% during the last month of the year, December. And guess what the 5 most common holiday crimes are? And this was in 2020. Shoplifting, identity theft, internet scams, domestic violence, and DUIs. The 10th commandment, it describes Christmas. Covetousness. It's all about what one gets, not so much about giving. They all have these desires. Covetousness causes a lot of these other things. That's why people steal. That's why they murder. That's why they commit all these other crimes. Because they want something that's not theirs. When you look at this holiday and others like it, and you look at the commandments and what Jesus Christ teaches us, you can find more examples of how this is against God and it defiles Jesus Christ. God has been gracious to us all. He has called us out of this world, away from the false traditions of men that truly honors Satan, not God, not Jesus Christ. Brethren, I know we can feel alone sometimes when we follow God's way and we reject the teachings of men. But we have each other. We have each other. And we will all rejoice together in God's kingdom one day, if we stay the course that God has set us on. 81 days till Passover.